There are stories that hide more than meets the eye. Today you will hear one of them. Watch until the end so you don't miss the most important part. Subscribe, give a like, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Thomas Miller had been working at St. Jude's Cathedral for years, quietly performing his duties before the morning service. He was not the kind of man who enjoyed attention. His days were filled with simple routines, sweeping the vast stone floors, polishing the wooden pews, and ensuring the church's silence was preserved. He took comfort in the rhythm of work, in the echo of his footsteps on cold marble, and in the flicker of candles that burned low in the morning light. Life outside the cathedral walls was noisy and chaotic. But here, Thomas found order and purpose. His faith had weakened over the years, though he never admitted it aloud. He was respectful of the sacred space, but harbored private doubts that he considered shameful. One morning, as he passed through the central nave carrying his cleaning supplies, his eyes caught something unusual on the bronze statue that dominated the sanctuary. The statue, a tall figure of a saint cast centuries ago, was the pride of the cathedral. Pilgrims often prayed before it, touching the cool bronze surface as though it carried the saint's blessing. But today, the statue looked different. Thomas stopped mid-step. Dark streaks marked the saint's face, running from the eyes down to the chin. They looked disturbingly like tears, but not clear tears. They were brownish red, streaks of rust that had seeped through the surface of the metal. His first thought was that it was some trick of light. He set down his broom and approached the statue, heart thudding louder with every step. The streaks were real, staining the bronze with a texture that looked too thick to be dust or candle smoke. He hesitated before touching it, then carefully raised his rag and tried to wipe the marks away. To his surprise, the cloth came back almost clean. The streaks resisted as though fused into the statue itself. The more he rubbed, the less sense it made. The bronze should have been smooth, but under his hand he felt roughness, like something corroded from within. Thomas frowned and stepped back. The church was silent, and the statue stared forward with blank metal eyes that now seemed almost alive. The streaks gave the impression that the saint had wept in the night. He whispered to himself, "This is not right." That day, he tried to convince himself it was just moisture, perhaps some trick caused by condensation and dust mixing on the bronze. Yet the thought unsettled him throughout the day. The following morning, Thomas returned to his duties early, still thinking about the strange sight. When he entered the sanctuary again, his stomach dropped. The streaks were back, darker than before, as though the statue had continued to weep after he had left. This time they were thicker, running down farther, staining the pedestal as well. He leaned in closer, touched the lines with his fingertip, and recoiled. The substance was metallic, gritty, not like any stain he had seen before. He felt as though the statue itself was trying to reveal something hidden deep inside. Thomas spent the next hour pacing the empty cathedral. He tried cleaning again harder this time, but the marks would not fade. The bronze was resisting his every effort. Finally, he gave up, his hands trembling. He was not a superstitious man, or at least he liked to think so, but what he had seen gnawed at him in a way he could not shake off. By midday, whispers had begun. One of the early visitors noticed the streaks and gasped. She bent to her knees and began to pray fervently, murmuring words about miracles and signs. Another man, curious, leaned in and confirmed what Thomas had seen. The statue appeared to be crying. Word spread quickly among the small crowd of worshippers. Some believed it was divine. Others whispered about judgment or punishment. Within hours, rumors reached beyond the church. People in the nearby streets began discussing the crying statue, some even walking into the cathedral just to see for themselves. Thomas felt a growing unease. What had begun as a private observation was now slipping out of his control. Every time he looked at the statue, the streak seemed heavier, as if the figure had taken on a burden too great to carry. He watched the worshippers. Some were moved to tears themselves, others trembled with fear. A few even muttered about the end of days. For the first time in his life, Thomas felt caught between worlds. His rational mind told him something was physically wrong with the statue. Yet the atmosphere in the cathedral pulsed with a tension that made even him wonder if something divine or perhaps darker was at work. That evening, when the cathedral was finally empty, Thomas lingered longer than usual. He could not stop staring at the statue. The bronze seemed darker in the fading light, the streaks more sinister than sorrowful. He remembered his failed attempts to clean them away and shuddered. Alone in the silence, he thought he heard something faint, like a groan of metal from deep within the statue. He shook his head, refusing to let his imagination run wild. Still, he left the cathedral with his heart heavy and his mind restless. By the next morning, the matter was no longer private at all. A small group had gathered before the doors even opened, waiting to see the weeping saint. They carried candles, rosaries, and cell phones to record what they believed was a miracle. Thomas could do nothing to stop them. As he went about his duties, the crowd's murmurs filled the sanctuary, blending with the steady gaze of the statue. The janitor knew that soon the church administration would take notice, and perhaps then someone with more authority could explain what was happening. Yet, a part of him feared that there might be no simple explanation. That fear was confirmed when the cathedral's rector, having heard the stories, approached Thomas that afternoon and asked him directly what he had seen. Thomas hesitated, then told the truth. The stains had appeared suddenly, and they returned darker every morning despite his efforts to clean them. The rector frowned deeply, then turned to look at the statue himself. His face paled, and he quickly summoned the church staff. Within hours, decisions were made. Specialists would need to be called. Something about the statue was not normal, and the responsibility had grown too great for the clergy alone. As Thomas swept the floor that evening, listening to the whispers echo through the vast space, he realized the peace he had once cherished in the cathedral was gone. The statue no longer stood as a silent guardian of faith, but as a source of dread and speculation. He glanced at the bronze face streaked with what looked like tears, and for a brief moment he wondered if the figure was truly trying to tell them something. Whatever the truth was, he sensed that it would not bring comfort. When he finally locked the doors for the night, Thomas carried the unease with him. The streets outside buzzed with talk of miracles, but in his chest, there was only a heavy certainty. This was no miracle. Something was wrong. And whatever it was only just beginning to reveal itself. By the following week, the story of the crying statue had spread far beyond the quiet walls of St. Jude's Cathedral. What began as whispers among the parishioners had turned into a growing tide of fascination, fear, and rumor that swept through the city. The small gatherings of onlookers soon multiplied until every day the cathedral steps were crowded with people eager to witness the phenomenon. Some came clutching candles and crosses, hoping to see what they believed was a divine miracle. Others arrived with skeptical eyes, determined to expose what they suspected was a trick or a fraud. Among them were reporters with cameras and notebooks, capturing every angle of the weeping bronze saint for headlines that would run across newspapers and television broadcasts. The cathedral itself, once a place of quiet refuge, had become an arena of tension. Inside, the sanctuary was filled with a murmur of voices and the restless shuffling of feet. Where Thomas Miller once worked in solitude, he now found himself navigating around throngs of curious visitors. The air was thick with incense and whispered prayers, but beneath it pulsed something darker, a current of unease that unsettled him more than the streaks on the statue's face. People argued in hushed tones, some insisting the tears were proof of God's sorrow, others warning that it was a harbinger of catastrophe. One woman collapsed in front of the statue, sobbing uncontrollably, convinced the end of the world was near. Thomas tried to keep to his duties, sweeping the floor and clearing the pews, but he could not ignore the way the atmosphere had changed. Every eye seemed fixed on the statue, every gesture charged with expectation. He overheard conversations that made his skin crawl, speculations about plagues, punishments, and omens. It was as if the streaks of rust had become a mirror for people's deepest fears. The janitor wished he had never seen them, wished he had never spoken a word, but now it was too late. The secret had taken on a life of its own, and the cathedral was no longer his quiet refuge, but the stage for a growing drama. The clergy tried to maintain control, guiding the crowds and insisting on calm, but even they seemed divided. Some priests stood solemnly beside the statue, treating it with reverence, leading prayers for guidance. Others looked troubled, exchanging uneasy glances and lowering their voices when speaking to one another. Thomas noticed their hesitation, and it only deepened his unease. If even the priests were uncertain, what hope was there for clarity? The chaos reached new heights when the media declared the phenomenon a modern miracle. News vans lined the streets outside and broadcasts carried images of the statue's dark streaks into the homes of thousands. Pilgrims began to arrive from other towns, some traveling for hours just to kneel before the weeping saint. Vendors set up stalls outside the cathedral gates, selling candles, icons, and hastily printed pamphlets that speculated on the meaning of the tears. The once quiet square had turned into a noisy marketplace of faith, doubt, and fear. Thomas watched it all unfold with growing dread. Every day, the crowds grew larger, and every morning the streaks on the statue's face appeared darker, spreading further down its chest. He no longer dared to touch it. He kept his distance, glancing only when he had to, and each time it seemed less like a saint and more like a warning carved in bronze. At night, he lay awake, hearing the voices of the crowd in his memory, seeing the metal face streaked with rust like blood. One evening, the rector called Thomas into his office. The man's expression was grave, his voice heavy with concern. He asked Thomas once more to recount exactly what he had seen on that first morning. Thomas repeated the same words as before. The stains had appeared suddenly. They resisted cleaning, and they returned each day stronger than before. The rector listened carefully, then nodded and said that outside help would be necessary. The cathedral could no longer contain the frenzy, nor could the clergy explain what was happening. Experts must be brought in, specialists who could examine the statue scientifically and put an end to the speculation. When the announcement was made to the public that a team of art conservationists and scientists would investigate the statue, the reaction was immediate. Some welcomed the decision, eager for an explanation. Others protested, claiming that no science could touch what was clearly divine. Tensions rose outside the cathedral as arguments broke out between believers and skeptics. Still, the date was set. A team from the city museum and the university would arrive within days to begin their work. That night, as Thomas walked through the empty nave after the last of the visitors had left, he paused before the statue one final time. The streaks glistened faintly in the candlelight, almost as though they were fresh tears. The face of the saint, once serene, now seemed sorrowful and burdened. He felt the weight of what was to come pressing down on him. The frenzy outside was only a shadow of the storm that awaited. The specialists would soon arrive, and with them the truth. Thomas was not sure he wanted to know it. He turned away, locked the great wooden doors of the cathedral, and stepped out into the night, knowing that when morning came, the world inside would never be the same. The city was waiting, the crowds were restless, and the eyes of the world were upon the weeping saint. The stage was set for revelation, and Thomas felt the first chill of dread in his bones. The truth, he knew, would not bring peace. It would bring something else entirely, something he could not yet name. The morning the specialists arrived, the cathedral was already filled with a tense silence. The crowds outside pressed against the barricades that had been erected by the authorities to control the flow of people. But the inside of St. Jude's was emptied of visitors for the first time in weeks. Only the clergy, a handful of staff, and the arriving team of experts were permitted to enter. Thomas watched nervously as the group walked down the nave. They carried cases of equipment and spoke in hushed, deliberate tones, their faces focused and grim. These were not pilgrims or priests. They were scientists, conservators, and technicians summoned to bring reason into a place that had been drowning in fear and speculation. The leader of the team, a stern woman with years of experience handling ancient works of art, approached the statue with professional detachment. She circled the bronze figure slowly, observing every angle, taking notes. Her colleagues set up lights and cameras documenting the surface meticulously. They spoke about corrosion, uneven weight distribution, and the possibility of hidden structural damage. Thomas lingered at a distance, his mop and broom clutched uselessly in his hands. The words they used were technical, almost comforting in their normality. But even as they worked, their expressions betrayed unease. It did not take long before they began to notice something strange. One of the conservators tapped the base of the statue lightly and frowned. The sound that came back was not what he expected. Hollow, yes, but oddly muted, as though something inside was obstructing the echo. Another expert joined him, running a scanner along the surface, and the screen lit up with readings that caused the team to exchange uneasy glances. They whispered to each other, too low for Thomas to hear clearly, but he caught fragments, density, irregularities, internal corrosion, unusual weight. The lead conservator straightened and addressed the rector, her voice calm, but firm. She explained that the statue was not behaving like a simple bronze casting. Something inside was altering its structure, and without a thorough examination, there was no way to know the cause. She recommended transporting the statue to a controlled laboratory where they could perform scans and tests with greater accuracy. The rector, pale and sweating, nodded in agreement. Arrangements were made quickly. The cathedral, once a place of prayer, now resembled the staging ground for a delicate operation. Thomas stood silently as the experts prepared the equipment to move the statue. He could not tear his eyes from the dark streaks that still stained its face, the supposed tears that had brought so many to their knees. Now they seemed less like a miracle and more like the warning signs of something hidden, something decaying within. He remembered the whispers of the crowd, the cries of those who believed in divine punishment, and felt a chill run through him. Whatever was inside the statue, it was not holiness. The transport went smoothly, though every moment was heavy with tension. The statue was carefully lifted and secured, then driven to a specialized facility under watchful eyes. Thomas did not accompany them, but he heard reports from the rector later that day. The team had wasted no time in setting up their examination. They would begin with industrial scanners, powerful enough to penetrate the bronze and reveal its hidden structure. That evening, Thomas lay awake in his small room near the cathedral. He imagined the statue under the glare of machines, its secrets being peeled away layer by layer. He told himself he wanted answers, but deep down he dreaded what those answers might be. The tears had always felt like a warning, and warnings were never given without reason. The following day, the news came back. The scans had begun. The technicians had gathered around the screens as the first images formed. At first, there was confusion, then silence. The figures on the monitors did not match the expected patterns of a hollow bronze statue. Instead, within the shape of the saint, several dark forms appeared, clustered together in the cavity of its chest and abdomen, cylindrical, corroded, unmistakably foreign. The room froze. One of the technicians swore under his breath. Another shouted for evacuation. The order came swiftly: clear the facility immediately. The cathedral administration was notified, and Thomas overheard the hurried explanations that followed. The objects inside the statue were not structural supports, not stones or debris, but containers, steel canisters, badly rusted, their contents unknown, but dangerous enough to warrant immediate caution. Security cordoned off the building, and the specialists called for a hazmat unit to investigate further. When Thomas heard the word evacuation, his blood turned cold. It was no longer a matter of strange stains or public hysteria. Something real and dangerous was hidden inside that statue. The cathedral was placed under restricted access, and the authorities warned that until the contents were identified and secured, no one would be allowed near it. The news spread quickly, though details were scarce. The faithful who had once flocked to see the miracle now gathered outside in fear, whispering of curses, conspiracies, and judgments. Some still prayed, convinced that the tears were still a sign, not of divinity, but of a warning against human cruelty. Others fled, unwilling to risk whatever calamity the statue carried. Thomas moved through these days like a man trapped in a waking dream. He had seen the first streaks, had been the first to notice the silent cries of the bronze saint, and now he lived with the knowledge of what they truly meant. He listened to the debates, the arguments, the fear that still lingered in the city, but he spoke little. The tears were no miracle, no curse, but they had changed him all the same. He thought often of the containers, of the poisonous vapor locked away for decades, waiting for discovery. It was not divine intervention that had wept through the statue, but the rusting grief of human violence. When the last of the hazardous materials was finally removed and neutralized, the cathedral reopened to the public. But the space was not the same. The empty pedestal stood in the sanctuary like a scar, a reminder of the danger that had been hidden within something once revered. Visitors came still, but their prayers were quieter, more uncertain, as if they could not decide whether they were addressing heaven or apologizing for the sins of humanity. Thomas, for his part, resumed his duties. He swept the floors, polished the pews, and lit the candles as he had always done. Yet, he felt different. The peace he once found in the cathedral no longer came easily. Every time he glanced at the empty space where the statue had stood, he was reminded of how fragile the boundary was between the sacred and the profane, between faith and fear. He had not found a miracle, but he had witnessed a truth that few could bear, that the past with all its horrors never truly disappears. It waits, hidden, until time or corrosion forces it back into the light. This is only a glimpse of what is yet to come. Want to discover more stories like this? Subscribe, leave a like, and be sure to comment which city or country you are watching from.